I am going to talk, as Courtney pointed out, about the cost of tariffs, some of the risks and realities for the Texas-Mexico relationship. See if I can get this to go here. Yep. So one of the first questions that I'd like to address is what is so special about the U.S.-Mexican relationship in general? Well, not everyone is aware that if you look at every pair of countries, the United States and Canada, Germany and France, Russia and Ukraine, the United States and Mexico lead the world in both migration and in trade. There's no other country pair in the world that has as much of a movement of people between them or as much trade and exchange between them as the United States in Mexico. In 2024, just last year, for example, trade between the United States and Mexico reached over $860 billion, making Mexico the United States' largest trading partner. So not only is this a significant relationship, obviously it's very important for the United States, and within that, Texas plays a central role. Texas, as most of you probably know, is the #1 exporting state in the United States, and its top trading partner is, of course, Mexico. On any given day, more than $1 billion in goods and services cross the Texas-Mexico border. And it's not just about volume, right? It's about how we trade. The two economies of Texas and Mexico and the United States and Mexico are integrated in ways that create shared value and drive global competitiveness. The reason why that's true is because the United States and Mexico are natural complements. Mexico's workforce and education complement those of the United States very well. Mexican universities and technical institutes are training engineers and technicians and skilled workers that fill crucial gaps in the U.S. market, in addition to the less skilled workers that obviously they also have in abundance. But this isn't just about outsourcing, right? It's about integrating capabilities that allow us to build things together. The second reason why this is so important is that geography really matters in trade, right? The proximity between Texas and Mexico keeps transportation costs very low and enables very agile, just-in-time production, which is critical for modern manufacturing. If you look at a wide range of products, whether it's cars or cows, they go back and forth across the border many times during their lifetimes in order to finally reach the final consumer. That kind of coordination only works with seamless logistics, and Mexico has done a great job at realizing that kind of capacity. The third is the cultural connection runs deep. I mean, especially in Texas, there's a shared language and a shared history, and that means that we've known each other a very long time. It's not just a matter of business partners, it's really a matter of family. And we don't always like each other in a family. We always sometimes have disagreements, but it's not just an economic advantage that we have. We have a very deep human connection, and that kind of trust is absolutely critical for making complex supply chains function and allow for innovation. So we're special throughout the world in this kind of partnership. If you look at how trade has changed over the last 30 to 40 years, it's really gravitated more towards the rise of global value chains. And that's a term people use a lot. But what that means is that the process of production is broken up into different stages, and different parts of production are moved to different countries where it's most efficient to produce them. That kind of production, that kind of global change has really favored the U.S.-Mexico relationship. If you look at the progression of Mexico, in 1993, Mexico was the third largest trading partner in terms of total volume for the United States. It moved up to #2 after NAFTA went into effect in 1994, and by 2003. Then we had a little bit of a rough decade with the rise of China when China joined the WTO in 2001. But now in 2023, Mexico again becomes the #1 trading partner for the United States. And this is really important to understand because Mexico is playing a very important role in many, many parts of the U.S. economy. The USMCA might have played a role in that. It went into effect on July 1st, 2020, and it's up for renewal very soon. So it's something that we should keep in mind about the importance of that trade relationship. Now, Texas, of course, does play a very special role. Jim just said that Dallas is the capital of NAFTA, capital of North America. And clearly you can see from this diagram, Texas is the heart of the North American economy. Leading Texas industries include energy, of course, and that was the reference to Houston, which is the energy capital of the world, including crude oil, natural gas, refined petroleum, and other products. But also agriculture is very critical. Cattle, cotton, corn, and hay are also very important. And we also have manufacturing, computer and electronics, chemicals, and automobiles. So Texas is a powerful engine for the United States economy. And a lot of the success in Texas comes from that close relationship with Mexico. If you look at Texas-Mexico trade over the last several years, it's really critical. Texas, as I said, trades significantly with Mexico. Texas is the #1 exporting country, and about 27% of Texas exports last year went to Mexico. But we also import a lot from Mexico as well. So if you look at last year's figures of $158 billion, that pushed two-way trade up to, about 280 some billion in 2024. Now, I've been to the border. I've been all around Texas, but especially if you go to Laredo, which is the busiest port almost in the world, they have 17,000 trucks a day cross that port. And they had last year $339 billion in total trade and handled more than 3 million incoming trucks. And that's about half of the southern border truck volume. I mean, there's a huge amount of transportation coming through that, just like blood goes through the heart. A lot of the trade comes through Texas. And if you look at the modal scale, right, we've managed to master freight, whether it's trucking, there's also rail, there's also shipping. And so Texas and Mexico have really figured out these logistics to really basically take advantage of that close relationship. So it's very, very important. It's very, very significant. Now, what are some of the leading sectors of trade? Well, not surprisingly, the type of things that Texas produces are also things that they export, whether it's mineral fuels, electricity, electrical machinery and equipment, other kinds of machinery, plastics, vehicles, and parts all play a really critical role in that trade. And I wanted to point out that we actually in Texas import a lot of the same kinds of things in terms of final product category. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is to emphasize the fact that really Texas and Mexico are often producing the same final goods. And this kind of two-way trade that you see in these two lists really represent this idea that there's parts flowing back and forth. There's intermediate goods coming from Texas into Mexico and then back into Texas. It could go back and forth several different times. And what else is really unique about these sectors is that these sectors are very complicated and they are differentiated and they are integrated. So that means that these are not just we're sending them raw cotton, in exchange for beer. There's a lot of very highly sophisticated parts and processes that are going into final modern manufacturing that leads North America to be producing common goods by working together. And that's really important. So what does that mean when I talk about, these goods are integrated? Well, that actually has very significant implications for how we think about the economy, right? So I've argued my entire career that Texas and Mexico actually they're not separate labor markets. It's actually part of a single labor market. And how do we know that? Well, labor market indicators such as wages and unemployment move together very, very closely over time. As a matter of fact, I'm working on a project right now where you're looking at the correlation between any two like U.S. cities in terms of the unemployment rates, how they move together over time. And as you would imagine, Dallas and Chicago move very closely together, and Chicago and Washington, D.C. move very closely together. It turns out that the Mexican cities, especially those on the border, are just as correlated with the U.S. unemployment movements as any other U.S. city. So that means that the northern part of Mexico, especially, but that means the Mexican economy, are really very much part of the U.S. economy. We also have to emphasize again that also means that workers in Mexico and workers in Texas work together to produce the same final goods. They're not substitutes in production as much as they are complements. So the Mexican workers produce the first part, the Texans produce the second part, it goes back, and Mexicans might do the third part, and then they put it all together for final sales. Now, why is this kind of integration so important from an economic perspective? Well, there's several advantages that come about from integration in goods, services, migration, and capital flows. One is that it significantly increases competitiveness in global markets. And I'd like to refer you to the book I published here with Chad Bowen and some others at the World Bank that talk about the world descending into these blocks and how regional integration, like between the United States and Mexico, is absolutely critical for making the bloc competitive in the global market. It also has significant benefits for consumers, right? So that kind of integration reduces prices for consumers, allowing us to increase our standard of living, which in many ways is what we're trying to do. It also creates jobs. It creates jobs in the US through specialization. If we focus on parts B and C and Mexico does part A, that creates more jobs for both of us in both countries. And that really helps us compete with those other areas that are highly regionally integrated, including East Asia and Europe. Obviously, there are some costs, though. There's a lot of doubters out there. There's a lot of people who are worried about integration. The big one, of course, is job displacement. And as an economist, I can't help but point out that this is not a new concern. Back in 1941, the very prominent economists Wolfgang Stolper and Paul Samuelson predicted that if we do not support workers who are hurt by trade, and they predicted there would be a lot of workers hurt by trade, voters would turn against trade. Our solution to that over the last several decades has been something called trade adjustment assistance, which now economists consider to be or have been inadequate for addressing the concerns of workers. And therefore, it's really not a surprise that now both Republicans and Democrats are basically supporting anti-trade platforms. As a matter of fact, when Trump first was elected, and especially even the second time when he was elected at the beginning of his administration, he and Biden had very, very similar views towards trade. It was uncanny how similar they really were. Other people are concerned about nationalism. They believe that we should be independent, that we should be making everything ourselves, which, is a view that some people have. And others are obviously are concerned about national security. I mean, when I was down in Laredo, the Border Patrol, the CBP was telling us that there's a lot of contraband that just comes through 17,000 trucks a day because they can't possibly get all of it yet. So we need to figure out how to address smuggling and other types of security concerns. So there are some costs. I mean, that's definitely true. So as a result of this anti-trade fervor and the result of concerns about these costs, I would say that 2025 has been a year of tariffs, right? And we see the timeline here starting in April 2nd, where there was the reciprocal tariff framework was announced. It was followed up by doubling the steel and aluminum tariffs. And then in July, the president announced an additional 30% tariff on imports from Mexico, which were suspended shortly after that, and specified that it was only going to be focusing on the USMCA non-qualifying goods. And so that 90-day window was supposed to run out in October, the end of October, but now on July 31st, there's a separate executive order that modifies those reciprocal tariff schedules. So it's really a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of change this year. There's a lot going on, and that actually plays a really big role in trade. So I think it's really important to first emphasize kind of what are tariffs. I mean, this has been the year of tariffs. What are tariffs? Well, the first thing I think that's very important to point out is that tariffs are taxes, just full stop. Tariffs are a tax on imports. And just like when you go to the store and you pay taxes on a car or anything, and maybe at the grocery store you might buy something and pay taxes there, taxes raise prices for you, the consumer. And exporters, usually do not pay uh, and so I'm going to get into that in a second, but it also, right, these tariffs also are creating lots of policy uncertainty. So when I was in El Paso, I was talking to a lot of the people in the business community, and they said, look, I mean, just tell us what the policy is going to be. Even if there's tariffs, we could deal with it. But the uncertainty is making us put off investment and making it difficult for us to place orders and to keep this economy going. So that policy uncertainty is actually playing a very big role in undermining economic growth. Now, what actually happened in terms of who paid those taxes? Well, there's been a lot of economic research that followed the original imposition of the tariffs and the subsequent tariffs as well. And we found that the US import prices did not fall at all, which they would have to if the foreigners were paying for tariffs, and they just weren't. And we also saw that the U.S. prices rose by, surprisingly, the amount of the tariff. So a 10% tariff was translated into a 10% increase in prices at the other end to the consumers. And that did raise revenue for the government. Definitely have to admit that it did increase revenue for the government, but it was just basically a sales tax on final consumers. And so when those consumers were companies like construction that were using steel for their projects, that means their input costs were rising as well, and that ripples through the economy. So, how is that ripple process actually happening? Well, it doesn't just happen immediately, and that was one thing that a lot of people said was, "Oh, they imposed these tariffs at the beginning of the year, and prices haven't gone up." Well, the reason for that is because it takes a while for the tariffs to work their way through the economy. And I kind of put together this graphic here to show that after tariffs go up, right, the first thing people do is they see the tariffs coming, so they stockpile inventory so that they are going to have lots to sell that was not affected by the tariff. And so those inventories are going to provide some delay for the tariff to kick in. Then the next thing that happens is that the producers have to pay those costs because they pay for the inputs, and then they probably eat some of that themselves before passing along to the consumers because they don't know if this is going to last or if it's not going to last, and they don't want to irritate their consumers. But eventually, if the policy stays in place long enough, then we see the rising consumer prices. So it's in July 2025, we saw the rise in producer prices, which is kind of the stage three here. And so it would be very reasonable to expect, and I'm not going to pretend to tell the future, but it'd be very reasonable to expect that if the tariffs stay in place, we can expect rising prices for consumers later into this year and clearly into the beginning of next year. And that's something that I think a lot of people are very concerned about. If you think that the election, one of the key election issues when Trump was elected, had to do with high prices and inflation. So this is something that we should all be very concerned about. But what are some of the benefits, right? So, I mean, one of the things we've heard the president say is that he loves tariffs. He loves the word tariffs. And so I would like to put forth maybe a provocative idea that it's not really an economic policy as much as it is a foreign policy to try and use tariffs to change the leveraging power or the bargaining power that we have relative to other countries. So tariffs are definitely causing a reshuffling of these global supply chains, but it's really difficult to kind of say we're going to pull out of China. But we're able to use these tariffs for non-trade objectives. So we're able to say, well, we're going to put in these tariffs unless Mexico addresses fentanyl, or we're going to put in these tariffs unless Mexico addresses migration from Central America or something like that. And they're very, very effective in that way because tariffs do a lot of damage to the economy, right? And so that's one of the key concerns is that we might be able to get some foreign policy victories as a result of imposing these tariffs. There's also some signs that Mexico might potentially benefit because of friendshoring or nearshoring, right? So the reshuffling of global supply chains means that now companies might have the opportunity to move back closer to the United States, to Mexico, and strengthen regional ties to allow us to increase global competitiveness. And that potential development might spill over even to Central America, creating economic opportunity there, which could even reduce migration, as I've shown in another paper or two. So there are some benefits from the tariffs that would allow Mexico to be in a great position. Mexico's in a great position to take advantage of these global tariffs, but there are some problems, right? There are some problems that we're imposing tariffs on Mexico. We're not really realizing the benefit that Mexico has to the Texas economy, to the U.S. economy. And so if the world really has fallen into these three main trade blocs, like Europe, East Asia, and North America, then we really do need to be promoting North American integration to remain competitive. We need Mexico on our team in order to compete globally, right? And that means we need to support Mexican efforts to address those security concerns, maybe in ways that don't involve tariffs or putting up barriers between the U.S. and the Mexican economy. We could also address migration with robust revisions to our visa programs and use sort of face recognition technologies to make the border crossings much more efficient in tracking people, and investing in border infrastructure to increase efficiency and security throughout the border. So the main point that I'm making here is that the U.S.-Mexico relationship obviously is really critical. It's important for the economy. Tariffs are putting up barriers and they're putting sand into the factory North America, and having a policy focus that says, okay, we're going to put tariffs on, other places, whether it's Zimbabwe or India or, something like that. But we really do need to promote North American integration in order for us to stay competitive. That's, I think, a policy direction that I think we should probably discuss and consider. So just to wrap up, I know I have just a couple minutes left. So one of the things I really want to emphasize is that this Texas-Mexico relationship is not just vital today, it's really the foundation of our future competitiveness as well. This idea of these trading blocks and global value chains are not going away. We need to figure out how we're going to be able to produce things efficiently with excellent logistics at low costs, and that Texas-Mexico relationship is going to play an incredibly critical role in that going forward. I would also encourage you all out there, if you're investors, to explore opportunities for investing in the region. I think there's great opportunities. I know that lots of businesses are expanding, especially in El Paso and the Juarez side. I know the commercial real estate's been doing very well in response to these tariffs. And so I would encourage all of you to think positively about these opportunities. But it's also important to realize, I think, that these tariffs and the policy uncertainty, as I mentioned, are adding sand, as I said, to the gears of factory North America, right? They're slowing down this very efficient economic machine that we have in place, and it's making us, the United States, less globally competitive. And I think it's underappreciated that this means it's risking American jobs. It's risking U.S. jobs. I mean, this played out in the automobile industry in particular, where the original tariffs went in, and companies, factories in Michigan weren't able to get the parts they needed because these tariffs were there. They couldn't afford them. So that meant their workers were idle until those parts appeared. And that means American workers are going to suffer as a result of these tariffs. And I think it's really important to listen to economists and understand kind of what are the economic implications for U.S. workers of slowing down global trade. And finally, my last point is that it's not too late to support the renewal of the USMCA. Hopefully, we can get on board to making sure that agreement stays in place, since it seems to have been really important in ensuring a competitive North America. So I want to thank all of you for attending today. It's really an honor to be here with you, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Raymond. Right on time to the minute. That was an excellent overview. Before I go any further, I have to issue a standard disclaimer that anything I may say in the next half hour or so is a personal opinion and not necessarily an opinion of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas or the Federal Reserve System. Just in terms of the broader context here, of course, 20 years ago, Richard Fisher became the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and Richard came in with a very interesting agenda on globalization. This was really the high tide of globalization in 2005, and we actually established a Globalization Institute to try to advance research on broad themes in international economics, capital flows, migration, all of those things. And for a lot of the time, up to the financial crisis, even after the financial crisis, globalization was really a tailwind for the US economy, a tailwind that made monetary policy very easy. But we seem to have we're coming full circle. I think we've reached a high point in terms of this trend towards globalization. And, the past couple of years, we're at an inflection point in terms of, I think the pandemic revealed certain issues with excessive reliance and specialization supply chains. There's growing national security concerns, and then I think the new administration has very different views about globalization. That's kind of the broad context, I think, in which all of this stuff is happening. Interestingly, our globalization initiative, it followed a previous initiative on Latin America. We had a Center for Latin American Economics, and that was kind of downgraded to focus on the world as a whole. Now that we've come full circle, our relaunched Global Institute that is now led by Kemu Yi and Enrique Martinez Garcia is actually refocusing on our relationship with Mexico and North America. So we're kind of coming full circle back to where we were in the 1990s. Um, so all this stuff, it's taking place against this context of these broader trade wars and this very different philosophy about the role of the U.S. in the global economy. I just want to pick up on one thing you talked about, Raymond, towards the end of your presentation about the use of tariffs as a tool of foreign policy to accomplish certain foreign policy objectives. And there seems to be no doubt that that's certainly part of what the administration is doing. And my question really is, you know, is this going to come at the cost of American leadership? American leadership was so important in the post-World War II period in constructing and maintaining a liberal international order. Open borders to the extent that we can deal with migration, open trade flows, open capital flows. We've been a big beneficiary of open capital flows. It certainly facilitated the financing of a lot of investment here and our large budget deficits. But you see a risk that by using this tool, so an analogy is, of course, the weaponization of the dollar as an instrument of foreign policy. There's concerns that at some point this might make the dollar less attractive as an international currency. But do you see a similar risk associated with the use of tariffs as a tool of foreign policy, that eventually we end up ceding our position of leadership, or we end up in a world where there is nobody championing the liberal trading order, liberal in the sense of free trade, free capital flows, appropriate migration flows, as suggested, as supported by domestic politics?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And I do want to take advantage of this opportunity to, thank you and especially, the Dallas Fed for all the amazing work you've done over the years. I mean, you've been a leader in North America and in the world, and the work you've done has been phenomenal. And I just want to make sure that everyone appreciates all the amazing work you've been doing. So in terms of U.S. leadership, I mean, I think in many ways, I do think, yes, that American leadership has clearly been lost in terms of free trade. We've been pushing back against, not just in the Trump administration, but in previous administrations, we've been pushing back against the WTO. The WTO has been harmed, maybe irreparably, by a lack of U.S. support. I think that's a big part. But we also have seen sort of a lack of U.S. leadership globally in just about every area, right? We pulled out of environmental treaties. We pulled out of health. We pulled back our USAID and all of our aid. So all of our soft power all our tools of soft power are basically gone now. And so we have pulled back in every way, almost all of our tools, except maybe development finance, in terms of our economic diplomacy. And so that creates a huge vacuum. And I think one of the big concerns, and you didn't mention this, but the loss of, power abhors a vacuum, just like nature. And when the United States pulls back, that leaves this vacuum, and that's clearly being filled by China. So then China is now going to be the global leader, and they have a vision of trade and a vision of foreign investment that's, global, but it's very different from ours. It's very different from having our vision, which was a rule of law based. It was very much, we were anti-corruption. We were very much anti-state-owned enterprises. We were very much pro free markets. And China is now filling the vacuum that we're creating with basically, in many ways, the opposite vision, right? They have state-owned enterprises. They do not have anti-corruption. They do not uphold the rule of law in terms of, corruption, anti-corruption, and bribes, and that sort of thing. I mean, they don't have the same rule-based trade focus that we do, and I think that is what it is, but it also, right, potentially has very easy to predict implications for the global economy.
Thanks. So we actually have a couple of questions already in the queue, so I'll just read these questions and then encourage other attendees to submit questions. So the first one in is from an anonymous attendee. What is your opinion on the potential for an open border trade policy similar to what you see in the European Union? Could something like that arise between Texas and Mexico, or between the United States and Mexico?
So that was the original vision. And funny enough, I'm actually teaching a class with John Negroponte, Ambassador John Negroponte, who was the ambassador to Mexico during the negotiation of NAFTA. And one of the things he was telling us a story in class last night about, that question where President Salinas of Mexico asked President George H.W. Bush if that exact question. And George H.W. Bush at that time responded and said, the AFL-CIO, the labor unions are never going to allow kind of that kind of open borders. Like they're never going to allow that free flow of labor. But I think that the position of unions has changed actually to a great degree about immigration when they've realized that immigrants actually are potential union members, that a lot of immigrants understand and have different views about unions that other people do. And so that might actually be an advantage for them now. So we know that that has changed. But having said that, I mean, I think if you just look at outside of, even just the unions to the general population, I think there's a broad anti-migrant, anti-foreign kind of feeling in this country right now that would make that type of policy extremely difficult with the current mood. And I think, there would be economic benefits, obviously, from that, but I think that there would have to be support in place, and I think there would have to be a change in the way Americans view their place and their relationship with foreigners.
Thanks. We've another question from Francisco Rojas. How can one support renewal of USMCA?
Right. So obviously it's going to be an issue that's debated in Congress. And so I always like to encourage everyone to get in touch with your representatives, both in the House and in the Senate, just to make sure that they're aware of your public support. I think that's very important. I think it's also important to tell your friends and make sure that they're doing the same thing. I think that especially today, right, it's really important for all of us to stay engaged with our elected representatives and let them know that we have strong feelings and we do appreciate views on that because, the elected officials, people say they're really influenced by lobbyists and other things, and that may be true, but at the end of the day, votes really do matter. And so making your voice heard and being active and expressing your opinion to them, I think is a great way to go about that. And we need your voice. We need your voice out there. I think it'd be very important.
Next question from Hiroki Takeuchi. Texas, Mexico, and U.S.-Mexico two-way trade is complicated, differentiated, and integrated. How should we deliver such a complex message to ordinary people in the age of social media where simple messages are easier to spread? How do you get that onto a bumper sticker, I think is what he's really asking, or
You need, yeah, made in Tex-Mex, right? You need like a little just made in
yeah.
Tex-Mex is a great bumper sticker. That would do it. I mean, the things, if you look at anything now, whether it's, a lot of times clothing or cars or computers or furniture, like a lot of it is not made entirely in one country anymore. And I think almost everything is made with products around the world. We import clothing from China, but we're also exporting cotton to China that they're using to make the fabric that they turn into that clothing. So a lot of the clothing that says made in China was made from U.S. cotton. And I think that is the kind of message that we want to convey, that everything's made everywhere, but things made in the Tex-Mex region, Tex-Mex is best. Tex-Mex is best, is simple. That's the message I would like to share.
Good. Okay, another question. In light of recent tariff threats from President Trump to Mexico and enhanced security cooperation as response from President Sheinbaum, what do you think of the Trump-Sheinbaum relationship and what implications does it have for the future of the Texas-Mexico trade and border dynamics?
Yeah, that's a great question. These are all been really great questions. I think that the relationship between the president of Mexico and the president of the United States is a really, really important one that's underappreciated in global politics, right? Because we're very close neighbors and it's important that we have a good relationship. I think it's encouraging that these two actually have the kind of dialogue that they have, and it hasn't been as antagonistic as the president's relationship with other world leaders has been. And so I think that that is actually cause for optimism, and I think that there's hope for further cooperation. I will say, obviously, there's always this underlying tension. Earlier, so the last several weeks, President Sheinbaum made it very clear that she would not tolerate any military intervention into Mexico by the United States. And so that is a long-standing concern that the Mexicans have. And so it's great, in a sense that, she's clearly not just rolling over. She's not having a good relationship because she just does whatever the president says. She holds her ground and she really represents Mexico, I think, very well in the sense of standing up for Mexico's interests, right? I think that that's important. I mean, obviously, there's other issues and people have concerns about her for many reasons, but that relationship seems to be a cause for optimism.
Next question. Can you speak about the fentanyl tariff exemption uh, from Mexico that the imports from Mexico receive when they're under the USMCA trade agreement? What do we know? What percentage of goods coming from Mexico are covered by that?
So, right. So the idea, so I'll back up a little bit to provide some background. So NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, went into effect January 1st, 1994, but not everything was granted tariff-free status then. So there was about a 13-year phase-in period, so that by 15 years later, basically almost everything was covered by NAFTA. And so I think it's very interesting that we're only putting tariffs on sort of the non-USMCA covered goods because USMCA was more than 90% similar to NAFTA. So it didn't create a lot of additional exemptions. It still meant that almost everything was covered under the USMCA. So that actually is a great point because the tariffs that are put on the non-USMCA covered goods really brings these tariffs into perspective, right? Because they're not affecting that many goods. What's really more concerning are the other tariffs on steel and other big inputs that are being affected because that's significant export from Mexico. So it's generally that exemption makes the tariffs not seem like that big of a deal, but these other tariffs on specific goods, automobiles, steel, are really important. When I was living in Mexico City way back when NAFTA was being negotiated, I remember some of the Mexican officials said, the word then was that, Mexico had very high tariffs, 20%, 25% average tariffs, and the United States had very low tariffs, like 3 to 4%. And they said, well, that's true. The United States has very low average tariffs, but they only have high tariffs on things we export. And that's exactly kind of what's going on, right? So that the main things that Mexico exports are the things that are being targeted by these special other tariffs, which makes the trade negotiations matter.
So I'd like to just zoom out a second while we're waiting for additional questions on just the broader issue of regional integration. I remember when I was a student in graduate school studying international economics, reading a lot of Jagdish Bhagwati's work on the downside of regional trading blocks that you get this fragmentation of the global system, for want of a better word, that actually ends up being more costly than beneficial to the participants in these agreements. And apparently, we have multiple regional trade. I mean, the EU is like the premier example of something like that. I mean, I think the political origins of European integration are very different from the dynamics that drive integration in pretty much any other part of the world. But there is this potential downside to sort of talking about all the benefits that come from, a North American trade bloc. Can you talk a bit about this issue of the potential costs? Are these real costs or are they really of second order compared to what we would benefit from just having a lot of free trade in North America?
Right. So one of the things I remember from grad school, so this also brings me back as a couple points to make of that, is that from a strategic interaction perspective, the worst number of blocks is three. Like that reduces welfare the most. And yeah, so having the world disintegrate into blocks is not great, and having three blocks in particular is the worst that you can have from a strategic interaction point of view. And so, yeah, I mean, the regional blocks are clearly a second best to having like the WTO vision, right? Where we had everyone playing by a common set of rules, where we could all work together in a common framework. And because that broke down for a number of different reasons, we got the rise of these regional blocks, which is suboptimal. Exactly. So I agree with you 100%. But I will say that one of the other, you mentioned Jagdish Bhagwati, who of course is a hero to all of us, right, in the trade world. But he also had another principle that I really liked, which was the directness principle. And that is, if you want to help automobiles, you don't put tariffs on cars. You help automobiles directly, like you either train workers or you subsidize the industry directly or you do something much more direct, because the tariffs have these spillovers that distort prices throughout the economy, which make the economy as a whole less efficient. So there are ways to, if you want to help people, to be much more direct with your policies, and that's one of the lessons from Bhagwati that I think everyone should keep in mind. But thanks for bringing him up. I always like talking about him.
Uh, we've got another question from Hiroki here. If the EU and TPP take initiative to rebuild the international economic order, shouldn't Mexico restructure global supply chains outside of the United States, focusing on other TPP countries and the European Union?
That's a great question, and Hiroki, I wish I was. It's been too long since we've had a chance to hang out. So yeah, um, definitely. Actually, my response though is that Mexico already has. So Mexico has done that. So one of the things that bothered Mexico when they joined the NAFTA was 80 some percent, 85% of their trade was with the United States. So Mexico was the most proactive Latin American country in pursuing trade agreements with other countries around the world. And now they have, more than a dozen of all these other trade agreements, and that has allowed Mexico to significantly well, significantly, but to really reduce the dependence it has on the United States. It has, you can talk about the Volkswagen plant in Puebla, for example. If you walk around in Mexico City, there's all kinds of European products. And so that type of diversification already has been taking place. And Mexico realizes that having too much dependence on one country puts it in a very vulnerable position. And so they've been doing a lot of work to try and diversify, but still it's like 70%. So they're still at 65, 70% dependent on the US. So they probably have a ways to go.
Another question here from Ryan Kaler. Is Mexico capable of replacing China as a production partner with respect to the higher government corruption index and presence of militarized cartel organizations acting as local governments in many regions?
So yeah, so right. So that is a great question, and that's very astute. So I compliment you on that question. That's really great. Mexico has a lot of challenges, right? You mentioned two of them, right? There's sort of the problems with rule of law, which are really been identified by a number of economists as holding Mexico back. Obviously, the problem with the cartels has also been something that reduces business investment, because I've talked to investors and they said, we're worried about that. We're not going to hold on as a result of that. But there are other problems as well. I mean, so the bottom line is no, Mexico cannot replace China, but not just because of those two reasons, right? The other reasons have to do with the fact that there's two other big reasons why not. One is that China has more than 1 billion people. Mexico, might have 120 some million people. So, you know what I mean? So it's the scale is almost different by a factor of 10. So the things that they just don't have the same scale that China does. Secondly, I talked about there's, the global value chains break products up into these different parts. And so there's all these different parts that are going all over the world. But the other thing that people don't realize is that in order to successfully export anything, you're not just good at the production process, right? So it's not like if you're going to export t-shirts, you can't just be good at sewing. You have to be good at logistics. You have to be good at energy. You have to be good at like there's basically 10 different things, importing and exporting, the bureaucracy, like how quickly can you get imports through customs, and how quickly can you get your goods out, and how efficient is the customs system, right? So and the thing is that there's Bangladesh, Vietnam, Mexico. A lot of these countries are doing really well in the world because they've been able to master like 5 or 6 of these processes and do them really well. China does all 10 extremely well. And they're very, very good at everything that's involved in the production process. And that's why it's so difficult for countries, US companies, to extricate themselves from China. But also, it makes it difficult for other countries to take their place because they have a ways to go in terms of capacity, in terms of customs, logistics, rule of law, just kind of oversight, energy, right? I mean, you have to have consistent energy in these parks and water supply. So Mexico's got a ways to go. But my point that I was trying to make earlier was that we can figure out what Mexico needs and we can help Mexico overcome some of those shortcomings and really invest in Mexican capacity to make them much more productive. And at the same time, help them with the rule of law or, the cartels or whatever. But I think those kinds of investments are something that's very needed, but we need to have the focus and the political will to say we are going to focus on Mexico to make it definitely as productive as it possibly can be, and that's going to alleviate migration pressures, and it's going to make us as a continent much more competitive.
I think this is the last question in the queue for now, from Patricia Moore. Is data showing a negative impact of the disruption of the USMCA agreement in the Texas economy? And are there specific industries that are hurting at the moment because of all of this, both the uncertainty and the tariffs and where things are likely headed?
Yeah, so the trade data take months to come in, and this has been basically going on since July. So it's kind of there are definitely some signs. So the one of the best signs I can tell you is the Bank of America did a survey. They did a really nice report in June. They did a survey of kind of businesses, right? So it's not collecting the data yet because it takes too long to actually get those kind of data that you need. But in survey data, business leaders are very concerned, and they're expressing lots of concerns about the uncertainty, about the tariffs, about the other disruptions. And so they have said that they have been delaying investments, both physical and in placing orders, right, for other inputs. So, I mean, we do see that the business community is reacting and they are nervous about it. And so, what I have been hoping, and if there's some way I could do this better, I'd love advice from any of you. But I mean, how we can empower the business community to make their voice heard, because they're very concerned about this, but I don't feel like they've been vocal enough in saying we need more certainty. I mean, some industries have been. I mean, the automobile industry was able to convince the president that they need exceptions. The agricultural community in Texas was able to get some exceptions on migration because they realized, that so many of the Texas agricultural supply, so much of the Texas agricultural supply was provided by migrant labor. So, there are some pockets where they've been affected, but broadly speaking, I think I would like to find ways to empower the business community to speak with a unified voice.
I might just make a plug here, actually. For the excellent work done by my colleagues in the regional group here at the bank, we do a series of business outlook surveys, and every month actually, and they've asked a series of questions related to the tariffs and so on. And you can just go to the bank website and see what we have been learning in real time about this. I mean, it is having an effect. People are holding back, you know, making decisions about pricing and so on. But all that stuff's on our website. Um, Accessible to the general public. Has questions about when they're planning to pass on cost increases in pricing and so on. So a great source of information there on the Dallas Fed website. Let's see,
Great.
where are we at questions here? I'm sorry, I lost my page. Oh yes, again, Hiroki's got a lot of questions here today. If BYD proposes to build their assembly plant in Mexico, how should Mexico respond given the current circumstances?
Well, right. I think Mexico wants to be open to investments, as much as they can, right? I mean, I think that promoting investment in Mexico is really critical. I think it's a matter of finding, obviously, a balance, right? Of finding the right kind of balance is going to be really critical. But I think the attitude we want to approach these investments is to start out by saying, how do we make it work instead of we don't want this to happen? Like, what are the concerns and how can we address these concerns in order to make these investments profitable and productive? I think that's critical.
Yeah. So I want to come back to one thing you mentioned, since you talked about the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which I haven't thought about in more years than I care to mention, but about the disruptive effect of trade on workers and so on. There's two competing explanations for a lot of the very real economic distress we've seen and we see in many pockets of the United States, and it's not just in the United States. I mean, this is a global phenomenon in the advanced economies. But do you have views or thoughts on, you talked about trade adjustment assistance, but arguably technological progress has been a bigger source of problems to creating marginalized communities than has international trade. And arguably, we need something more robust than just helping people who lose jobs to trade. And of course, with the rise of AI, I know we're getting kind of really off topic here, but AI is going to affect us all potentially. We still are in very early
Yes.
days, but how do we potentially deal with just the general phenomenon of disruption, whether it's due to trade, technology, or something else? Do you have thoughts on the best way to design systems to sustain political support for an open trading order and an openness to technological innovation?
Yeah, I think that is the $1 million question, Dr. Wynn. I think that is absolutely the critical question. And going forward, I have two thoughts. I think about this quite a bit. One is that we need, I believe, that Stoper Samuelson teaches us that we need to think about people in large, broad groups that are not specific to industries, so that when one industry gets hurt, that actually affects all the workers that are predominantly employed in that industry and the similar ones in other industries. Like that has ripple effects that we say that are specific to factors, right? So it's not industries are not the ones that really take the hit as much as the factors. And that's what Stoper Samuelson teaches us. And that's why we really need to have schools like SMU and other schools that are playing a critical role in educating workers and making them much more productive and becoming much more accessible. The other thing we really need to do, so that's the first thing, we need to be investing in workers, investing in productivity across the board and not think about industry specific policies. That just doesn't, that's not sufficient. The second thing, though, that's really important is to understand the importance of adjustment costs. People hate to move and people hate changing jobs and people hate, you know what I mean? Like losing your job is a traumatic event because people hate change. And so we need to recognize the importance of those changing costs and help people to the best we can minimize those costs. Like we can subsidize your move, or we can help you find a new job, or we can provide technology. The AI, right, is really helping to create these job market platforms that minimize search times, that make it make it easier for young people, especially, to find jobs. I've done studies on that in other countries, and those are the two main ones. I mean, the third one you can kind of wrap those two together with the umbrella of something called.
Oh, looks like we may have lost Raymond there.
The agreement is frozen in mid-sentence here, and we're
If
getting
people
very
know
close.
that they're going to get, yeah.
You're back. Okay. Well, we're right at time. Actually, we're just 2 minutes, a little bit, a minute behind schedule. But this has been an absolutely fabulous discussion, and I've learned an awful lot from your presentation. So thank you, Raymond, and I will hand it over to Jim to close us out.
Well, I just want to echo what Mark Wynn said. I think this was an incredibly informative session. I hope many of you out there took notes, and I think the session will be recorded and online for those of you who want to review it later on. I was asked to summarize a few takeaways from this. I don't have much time to do that. I was going to say I'm inviting Professor Robertson and Dr. Wynn to come and lecture on Stoper Samuelson in my class next Tuesday at 8 a.m. And explain to us why the scarce factor seeks protection and the abundant factor is always for trade. And that's my takeaway from Stoper Samuelson. So I don't want to end on that technical note, but I just want to reinforce with everybody out there, we started this Texas-Mexico Center about a decade ago. And when I had this idea, I always said, as goes the Texas-Mexico relationship, so goes the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So Texas is in a very important position here to provide leadership for the broader U.S.-Mexico relationship. And I would be remiss, we've talked a lot about USMCA and NAFTA. Let's not forget our friends in Canada. I know Professor Robertson lives most of his time up there in Minneapolis and Minnesota. He knows something about Canada. Canada is incredibly important in this. It's one of our leading trading partners, and that relationship is not going well at the moment. Just a couple of other things to take away from this discussion. Watch out. I saw a headline the other day for sneakflation. I like that. The inflation will sneak up on us here if we're not careful. I do think we have to reinforce the point that tariffs are a very blunt instrument. Using them for foreign policy objectives is not the most efficient, productive way to pursue our goals with respect to foreign policy. So I think there are a lot of risks involved here in the current policy. We have to weigh those risks very, very carefully. And final point I would make, yes, the U.S. must provide leadership as we have for many, many decades. If we don't do that, nature abhors a vacuum. Certainly the international system abhors a vacuum. If we pull back and don't exercise leadership, that will be a very bad thing for the international political economy. Some have argued that Mexico and other countries in the world are free riding on the United States, that they've taken advantage of us. I see Professor Robertson shaking his head. I think that is not true. It hasn't been true for a long time. Again, we don't have time to get into this, but don't forget, throughout many decades, there have been a lot of riders in that bus, but the United States is driving the bus. It has been driving the bus. So I would like to see us continue to drive the bus and steer the bus of the global economy. So I will stop there and turn it back over to my colleague, Courtney Weeks.
Thank you. I want to thank you all again. This was a wonderful presentation, and I think we need to coin Tex-Mex is best. So don't be surprised if we start sending out those bumper stickers. That was fantastic. To sum it all up in one line, right? This relationship is critical, and it's important to realize that. And you've done a wonderful job, both of you. Thank you for explaining the importance of this. Finally, I just want to share a few upcoming events that we have on. So save the date. September 18th from 12 to 1, same time, we will have a webinar with Dr. Andrew Seeley, the president of the Migration Policy Institute, and the topic will be U.S. legal pathways for Mexican and Central American immigrants. And he'll be sharing some new research that was funded by the center, and he'll be presenting those findings. So please join us, and you'll be receiving some invites soon for that event. And also we have our annual symposium taking place in Mexico City this year on November 11th. So save the date for that as well. Make a trip to Mexico City. It's worth it. It's beautiful. And we will be sharing the findings of the research that we funded in the previous year. Again, highlighting the importance of this bilateral relationship. So those are the few events that we have coming up. Keep that in mind. And thank you again for joining us. And we hope to see you on the 18th for our next event. Thank you so much, Dr. Robertson and Dr. Wynn.
You're welcome.
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.